Now, the annexation of Texas was at least acquired through peaceful means and through the processes of American government. The next event would not follow the same lines. So the Mexican-American War is probably the most obvious and most unfortunate example of Democrat administrations and politicians pursuing the expansion and protection of slavery, utilizing federal resources. So the best way to consider this is that every northern Union state that was at this point, well, many decades into being free states, nonetheless helped fund military incursions that first instigated and then won the Mexican-American War for the purpose of expanding slavery. So one can imagine kind of the sense of injustice where you see not only the protection of an institution that you already view as being morally reprehensible and contrary to the founding, but then federal resources being used to expand and protect it as well, and in this case, through force of arms. So how this kind of happened here was just as he had initially with Texas. President James Polk made many attempts to purchase multiple territories from Spain. Spain rejected these attempts. So far, we're kind of following the same basic lines as the attempts to annex Mexico. However, in this case, there were no other diplomatic methods left, not even clandestine ones, such as hidden offers of $30 million, for example. And so instead, he carefully selected the third most qualified military official at the time. His name was Zachary Taylor. And Zachary Taylor was chosen because he was a Democrat. The two military men who outranked him and would have been preferable for this assignment were both Northern Whigs. They were very much opposed to slavery. And so Polk was not necessarily looking for a military man for this operation he was planning. He needed a Democrat party line man, an apparatchik. And so he settled on Zachary Taylor. And Taylor was told to go, or ultimately anyway, to go and occupy land that Mexico claimed. He was referred to this area specifically, and he was relocated to this area after his initial posting on the border between Mexico and the United States, until all diplomatic attempts to purchase territory failed. And once those failed, Taylor was ordered then to set up a post directly on Mexican territory. And of course, the idea was to instigate a violent confrontation, which is what happened. Now, through this confrontation, of course, then Polk goes to Congress and starts beating the battle drums of patriotic passion and fervor. And the public mind was compelled towards war because the events were marketed and described as an act of Mexican aggression. Of course, to not to lessen the events of the war itself, but for our purposes, it was the machinations prior and during the war that are most significant. The war was questionable from its onset, and Abraham Lincoln kind of rose to prominence during this time. Asking questions is pretty much what it comes down to. So at this point, he was a leading member of the Whig Party. The Republican Party had not yet formed and would not until around 1854, 1856, depending on how you examine it. And he, in a very lengthy speech which he delivers, which going through so many of his oratories, one is quick to learn that although Lincoln's speeches tended to be a little bit longer, it was because of thoroughness and conciseness. He very carefully examined every detail. This was a man who was a self-taught attorney, and he had memorized Euclid's Elements as a way to help him structure his thinking processes and his means of argumentation. You could see that reflected very, very powerfully in all of his speeches, especially in his debates, his upcoming debates with Stephen Douglas, who was far outmatched. So Lincoln goes in this lengthy examination of all of the details provided by the administration that were used to justify the Mexican-American War. And at the conclusion, he simply notes, "I propose to try to show that the whole of this issue and evidence is, from beginning to end, the sheerest deception." One of the leading guideposts for this type of criticism at the time was that Polk offered no explanation for the war and really obfuscated many details and the changing details that he used to justify it. And he also never specified any goal or ambition. Was it to take certain territory? Was it to enact a certain amount of casualties in retribution? What was the point of the war? Yes, we were in conflict, but what was the design and purpose? What was the military goal here? And of course, in a process that would become the mainstay of future wars, there was no end goal established. Now, General Scott, or rather, Lincoln, he notes that Polk nowhere intimates when he expects the war to terminate. At its beginning, General Scott was, by the same president, driven into disfavor, if not disgrace, for intimating that peace could not be conquered in less than 3 or 4 months. But now, at the end of about 20 months, the same president gives us a long message without showing us that as to the end he himself has even an imaginary conception. So what Lincoln's describing here is, when the war began, there was a gentleman by the name of General Scott, and he was rebuked by Polk for saying that it was unlikely that the Americans could win the war in less than 3 to 4 months, and Polk rebuked him for that. And now they've been at war, air quotes, for about 20 months, and now Polk is saying, well, you just never know about these things. Of course, the issue here was that the point of the war was to force Mexico to surrender slave territory. That was the guiding principle, but he couldn't just come out and say that, of course. He instead just phrased it as a war in defense of American dignity, and lots of the lofty platitudes and the kind of things that keep people's passions stirred up. So Lincoln presented a series of interrogatories called the spot resolutions. And these were, as you might suspect from a self-taught attorney, very specific questions meant to elucidate specific facts. Unfortunately, these resolutions were rejected, and not only by Democrats, but also by some fellow Whigs who felt that in the midst of the patriotic fervor, it was political suicide, and it likely wouldn't have resulted in any improvement of the circumstances. But one of the most vital and key arguments that Lincoln addresses here was the kind of repeated phrase, although it shifted, that the initial combat and conflict began on U.S. soil. So Lincoln explains, first, that the soil was ours when the hostilities commenced, and second, that whether it was rightfully ours or not, Congress had annexed it, and the President for that reason was bound to defend it, both of which are as clearly proved to be false in fact as you can prove that your house is mine. The soil was not ours, and Congress did not annex or attempt to annex it. So one of the larger really lies that Polk was saying and repeating ad nauseum was that the United States had in fact annexed this territory And as a consequence, that made it American territory. And so when Mexicans attacked, it was an attack from a foreign entity on domestic soil. And of course, that's incorrect. There was never any record of annexation. There was nothing. And so this also kind of opened a larger window, and one that's still extraordinarily relevant to the modern day, which was the arbitrary ability of presidents to engage in military action. And this was particularly manifested here, and it would be again, by phrasing wars as an act of self-defense. So, we must go invade and do X, Y, or Z because of national security concerns. Which isn't to say that that's not sometimes true. But where it's sometimes true, it is also sometimes a false and misleading impetus for engaging in a political war, which is exactly the case here. So Lincoln explains this, of course, better than I can. He says, "Allow the president to invade a neighboring nation whenever he shall deem it necessary to repel an invasion, and you allow him to do so whether he may choose to say he deems it necessary for such purpose, and you allow him to make war at pleasure. If today he should choose to say he thinks it necessary to invade Canada to prevent the British from invading us, how could you stop him? You may say to him, 'I see no probability of the British invading us.' But he will say to you, 'Be silent, I see it, even if you don't.'" And so in this short passage, Lincoln really encapsulates kind of the danger in the current foreign policy with presidential declarations of war. By accepting war as a suitable defense to hypothetical invasions and the like, was to leave the door wide open for exactly these kinds of events to occur, where a president can then kind of instigate conflicts or justify conflicts for a political or personal agenda that can just kind of otherwise be justified under this large, ambiguous, and very much undefined and unconstitutionally defined purpose of national defense or proactively resisting invasion. So, at the time, these events were treated in the public mind also as clearly and kind of a pro-slavery activist war. Now, that generally didn't discount from the patriotic side. One can believe that Americans were attacked on American soil, and yeah, they might have been provoked and it might have been instigated by our side, but that doesn't change the fact that X, Y, and Z. And yes, it might be to the utmost benefit for the slave states, but the defense of American dignity and honor and just defense of American soil rises above sectional interests. And although that is an admirable way to view such legitimate foreign threats, in this case, that unique kind of American understanding was a detriment. And this was acknowledged also by Henry Clay, one of the most amazing statesmen throughout the period. He was also the architect of the 1820 Compromise. And he delivered a speech in 1847. And he was addressing the annexation of Texas and the Mexican-American War, considered alongside another pro-slavery policy that was implemented in the House by the Democratic Party called the gag rule, which prevented the reading of any abolitionist petitions, which will actually be addressed in an upcoming episode, in episode 21. But Mr. Clay observes, "One proposes, in your behalf and mine, to disavow, in the most positive manner, any desire, on our part, to acquire any foreign territory whatever for the purpose of introducing slavery into it, to abstain from seeking to conquer and annex it to the United States, Mexico, or any part of it, and especially to disabuse the public mind in any quarter of the Union of the impression, if it anywhere exists, that a desire for such a conquest is cherished for the purpose of propagating slavery." So here Clay outlines exactly what was occurring at the time. of course, very eloquently. He's illustrating essentially the same arguments that I presented in this and in previous episodes, that the purpose of the war was in fact one for the expansion and protection of slavery, and so was the annexation of Texas. Now, Clay also goes on to insinuate that the point of the war was just for the political choices and desires of Polk, and did not reflect the overall temperature in Congress. And the biggest issue surrounding this, of course, was that it was difficult for someone to come to an informed and proper opinion on the matter because so many facts were obfuscated or withheld or changed from time to time. Again, quite applicable to the current infection of historical revisionism. So he continues. He says, if a war be commenced without any previous declaration of its objects, as in the case of the existing war with Mexico, Congress must necessarily possess the authority at any time to declare for what purposes it shall be further prosecuted. If we suppose Congress does not possess the controlling authority attributed to it, if it be contended that a war having been once commenced, the President of the United States may direct it to the accomplishment of any objects he pleases, without consulting and without regard to the will of Congress, the convention will have utterly failed in guarding the nation against the abuses and ambitions of a single individual. Either Congress or the President must have the right of determining upon the objects for which a war shall be prosecuted. There is no other alternative. If the President possesses it and may prosecute it for objects against the will of Congress, where is the difference in our free government and that of any other nation which may be governed by an absolute czar, emperor, or king? Now, of course, these observations made by Clay resonate all through American history, up to and especially including the modern times, where a series of wars are essentially solo operations conducted by the executive with little or no insight from Congress. And this, as we can see here, this pattern establishes itself very early in American history, and to great consternation by those who seek to maintain the founding principles of checks and balance and enumerated powers, just to avoid these kinds of abuses. Now, kind of like the annexation of Texas, obviously, the Mexican-American War was a boon to the slave states and the what came to be called the slave power, term that kind of addresses the overall political abilities of the slave states. America, of course, won the war, and as a consequence, acquired massive amounts of territory, territory that would actually lead to yet more civil strife and political strife in trying to determine how that territory should be divided and how it should enter the Union. But while all that was still occurring, the Democrat administration was still seeking to expand slave territory, this time through an event came to be called the Ostend Manifesto, where they attempted to use clandestine ways to instigate a slave insurrection as an excuse to invade and annex Cuba.